Hi everybody, Greg Porter. This is our final of 5 lessons on the life of Joseph. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and I hope you have as well. Just a quick review from last session. Joseph has been placed essentially over just about everybody in the kingdom in Egypt except for Pharaoh, over the cupbearer, over his jailers, over Potiphar's wife, all really over those who have mistreated him, have dealt great injustices to him. But there's no hint, thus far anyway, of any reprisal, that is a miracle in and of itself. It's so easy in those situations to think, aha, now God's given me power in order to destroy my enemies. But Joseph doesn't go there. Yeah, again, he reminds me of David in dealing with Saul. He had many chances for payback to Saul, and he didn't take advantage of any of them. So, anyway, the king has a dream, Pharaoh has a dream, and Joseph is summoned because it's politically advantageous for the cupbearer to mention Joseph. And in the name of God, ultimately in the name of Yahweh, Joseph is given the interpretation, and he explains to the Pharaoh, the king, that there'll be 7 years of fruitful grain production throughout the kingdom, and that it should be safe because that was going to be followed by 7 years of severe famine. And it was a profound famine, such that it really, I gather, it really was going to extend far even beyond the kingdom of Egypt. It made it all the way back to Canaan, because we know that Joseph's own family was suffering from it. And so as things begin to unfold just as Joseph has predicted, of course his stock went up in the eyes of Pharaoh, and essentially Pharaoh entrusted him with just about everything. And much like kind of Potiphar did, except on a much larger scale. So in chapter 42 of Genesis, word travels to Joseph's father, Jacob, that there is abundant food in Egypt. Little does he know that behind it all is his youngest son, Joseph, who is behind it all and actually very much alive. And not only is he alive, he is helping to sustain the lives of other people. And so he sends his sons to Egypt in an attempt to obtain food. And it says this in Genesis 42. Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. So, by the way, just a quick aside, that's interesting to me, is he doesn't even want to go there. Even the possibility of a repeat performance. It almost suggests that Jacob knew there was something going on with the other brothers, that maybe there's still a degree of suspicion over what happened to Joseph. Who knows? But clearly he doesn't want to even offer the possibility of losing a young son at the hands of his older sons. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed to him. So that's the first bow. Remember, there were 2 dreams in which they bowed, with their faces to the ground. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, Where have you come from? And they said, From the land of Canaan, to buy food. But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although again they did not recognize him. So Joseph's brothers, they trekked to Egypt only to stand before Joseph, who is unrecognizable to them, to plead for food. And Joseph goes on, and this is very interesting. We don't know what's really motivating him, but he's beginning to manipulate some circumstances here. Now, whether he does it with malice or whether he does it with other motives, we don't know for certain. We can certainly speculate, and a lot of what we can do on Sunday morning even is to discuss what you think his motives were. But Joseph asserts that his brothers are spies, and he has them placed in prison for 3 days. And then he agrees to let them go except for Simeon, who remained in Egypt as essentially as collateral to ensure that Benjamin, who he requests that their youngest brother be brought to Egypt from Canaan. So we don't know if that's vengeful. We don't know if it's calculated for another purpose. My sense is, based upon the general trajectory of Joseph's life, is he is running an experiment that's critical. And he's trying essentially to discern whether or not his brothers are the same brothers that left him and basically human trafficked him when he was much younger. He's recreating the circumstances in which that could possibly happen again to see how they would respond. But stay tuned. Let's see. Well, and so Joseph's brothers were, at least according to my theory, effectively given another opportunity to decide whether they were going to sell off a brother, in this case Simeon, who was essentially collateral being kept in Egypt, and then maybe just lie to their father about it again to save their own skin, to avoid having to go into danger, and maybe figure out another way to get some food. Now, it's interesting to note that on their way back to Canaan, Joseph had ordered his servants to return the money that his brothers had brought with them to Egypt, presumably to purchase the grain. So in other words, Joseph refuses to take money or even make money, maybe I could put it that way, off of his brothers. So he gives them ample grain and their money back. So he refuses to make money off of his brothers, right? Because they had made money off of him. And secondly, it's the first sign of grace that he essentially gives them free grain. It's not just forgiveness, right? It's one step beyond that, it seems to me. This is the first hint of that. He's giving them grace on top of forgiveness. So anyway, back to our story. Jacob reluctantly, under much duress, agrees to send Benjamin with his brothers back to Egypt to get grain and to free their brother Simeon. And so they make their way back to Egypt. They arrive at Joseph's house, which was probably palatial. And for the second time, Joseph, we notice, has to dismiss himself to grieve over the tragic events that have taken place when he sees his younger brother Benjamin. So this is the second time that Joseph actually has to kind of excuse himself and turn away. And you get the sense that he's grieving deeply. And there's a couple of things I was thinking about that with Joseph's grieving and mourning, that just brief little testaments to kind of give us a glimpse inside of Joseph's soul. First of all, it's really unusual that a man with Joseph's history and power remains so tender and empathetic. You've heard it said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So Joseph is very interesting. You often see this with revolutions, right? By the time the revolutions is over, the people that take over have got a grudge to begin with, and they end up being worse tyrants than those that they've replaced. But not so with Joseph. He's willing to extend not just forgiveness, at least we begin to get that sense here, but he's actually showing grace on top of that. What's that, the Who song, Bab O'Reilly? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? But it's very unusual that Joseph, he acquires power, and he has every right to use that power to enact justice for the grudge that he may be feeling. He doesn't go there. And secondly, even though it's unusual for a man, I think, of Joseph's history and his power to remain so empathetic, he's a tender-hearted ruler, and that's extremely unusual. And secondly, it tells us that Joseph is, in some ways, not denying the pain of what has happened to him, right? It still cuts deeply into his soul, but he's just seen them bow down to him. And so in some ways, maybe he's mourning the fact that, I don't know, mourning is the right word, but he's recognizing the fact that the painful experiences of his life were placed in service to his dreams. His dreams were very good. They were very favorable. Who doesn't like people bowing down to you? That's not a nightmare. That's a very pleasant dream. But maybe it's all beginning to click with him that he had to go through these painful experiences in order to have that dream, that prophetic dream, realized. And the fact that he's mourning suggests that the pain was very real. And so it just makes me think, as you look back on your life, as I look back on my own life, and think of those painful experiences in our lives, can you see a thread of grace running through it? You know, maybe not, maybe so, but it's instructive that Joseph was allowed to see the end, see those dreams come true, those prophetic dreams, see the end of his brothers bowing before him. But he was not given, until it happened, the means through which that would come to fruition. Maybe it would have been too much for him to handle at the time. But now you get the sense that he's putting all the pieces together. And it's, on the one hand, something to celebrate because God has once again been proven true. But the means through which that happened was very real and very painful. You ever met somebody who's just has a level of depth about them and a serenity about them that you find compelling? I think my hunch is, and the people that I've met that sort of exude that, often if you really dig deeper, you'll find out that they had one, or not, maybe even more than one, dark nights of the soul, where they had to go through really hard times, and they came out on the other side with a level of confidence in God and trust that manifests itself in this weightiness and gravitas that was compelling. And it's not like they were trying to exude that. It just was who they were. And it seems like God often uses those painful things to create beautiful ends. And maybe that's what Joseph is coming to realize. So he saw the end, and that was something to be excited about when he saw the dreams when he was younger, that his brothers were going to bow down to him. What younger brother doesn't love that? But what he didn't see and what was not shown to him, maybe because simply God knows that we are but dust, and he knows that we can only take so much. He wasn't treated to the means to that end. And the means was an arduous road indeed. Back to events in Egypt. So again, his brothers bow down before Joseph, and so Joseph, interestingly enough, continues his this scheming, right? We would say, my gosh, is he resorting back to Jacob a little bit? He plants evidence of robbery in the form of gold and silver in Benjamin's sack, and he charges him with a crime. And of course, this is a real crisis on so many levels. So in chapter 44, Judah demonstrates that he's changed, that he actually feels empathy for his father, and that he loves his father, and I assume Benjamin, enough to literally give his life if necessary, or at least his freedom in exchange for Benjamin, and as a means of not putting his father through the pain of losing another young child. And I was thinking about Judah. He is a fascinating character. This is what's so beautiful about Joseph's story isn't Judah a good example of the messiness of people and how God works in and through that mess, and often through those weird, messy people? Like you're prone to write them off. Just like even with Joseph early on, it's like, this kid is a spoiled brat. He is heading for trouble. And yet, amazing how he is the man that he has become, right? We can never predict what God's going to do in people's lives. So think about Judah, right? Think about what a complex character he is. In chapter 37, Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it? They were considering, killing Joseph. And he interrupts and says, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. So isn't that incident in some ways sums up Judah's life? He's bad, but he could be worse. So he's bad, but not always as bad as he could be. So there's this incredible mix of good and evil in him. Like on the one hand, we don't want to kill the kid. Let's just make some money and sell him into slavery. Thank God for small mercies. So, and then in chapter 38 with Judah, we learn that he has two evil sons who lose their lives, right? That gets his attention. And then he breaks his promise to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, refusing to allow his youngest son, Shelah, to marry her, even though he had promised that. He literally got cold feet, and so he pulls the plug on that. And then in chapter 30, so he's a man who doesn't keep his word. And then in chapter 38, Judah's wife dies. So what does Judah do? He goes off looking for a prostitute. And he ends up betting his daughter-in-law, Tamar, who deceives her deceiver. Now, she's been deceived by him. Well, it's payback time. Tamar, she deceives her deceiver. She dresses up like a prostitute, and she becomes pregnant with twins by her father-in-law. Wow, it doesn't get any wilder than this. And then there's chapter 44 where Judah exhibits incredible empathy for his father. And, I would assume, empathy for Benjamin. And in some ways, this is an opportunity to atone for what he's done, and he offers his life in exchange for his brother Benjamin's life, or at least his freedom. Amazing, the messiness of people, and how God works even through messy people. So, once again, back to Egypt. So tender-hearted Joseph could not control himself. This is the third or fourth time he dismisses his brothers so he could just sob. I mean, you get the sense that it's just this cry from a very broken heart and soul, mourning about what has happened, what could have been, mourning about the means, that the end is good, but the means are so darn painful. And my sense is that maybe, again, these are tears kind of like Judah that are a mix of both sadness and joy. And so Joseph can't do it any longer. He reveals his identity to his brothers, and their heads explode. I mean, he probably looked at one another and they mouthed, "Oh, Sheol." Hey, everybody. Note that I'm recording these sections. Oh, there's our phone in the background. In different locations today. But pay no attention to the phone in the background, neither the cat that's meowing also in the background. If we take a 30,000-foot view of Joseph's life at this point, having revealed who he is to his brothers, having broken down many times because of all that he has encountered, his tears were probably a mixture of both joy and sadness. There are so many things emotionally probably going on with him right now. But if we take a step back and look at his life now from 30,000 feet, the big picture, it's really pretty amazing. Joseph has gone from a competitor with others for himself to gain the affection of an idol, his father, Jacob. He was in competition with his brothers for the affection of that idol. He arrives in Egypt, a cooperator with God for others. He's now suddenly, instead of writing his own script and making himself the star, he's accepting the scenes that God has assigned him to and playing the role that God wants him to play, that is the Abrahamic covenant, blessed by God to bless others in that scene. So he is, think of it, he's gone from being a blusterer and a boaster to a blesser, from a self-centered young man to an other-centered young man. He has served and he has blessed his Ishmaelite captors. his owner Potiphar, and frankly, Potiphar's wife by not complying, to be honest. He was serving her as well. He was serving his fellow inmates, and now he's serving Pharaoh, and by extension, Egypt as an entire nation. It's like the uber Abrahamic covenant enactor. And now Joseph faces his most difficult task to date. He has to decide whether to execute justice or to forgive that most difficult constituency of people, his betrayers, those whose injustice toward him set in motion a host of other subsequent injustices that he suffered. And what makes it even harder is this is his own flesh and blood, which again is probably among the most difficult constituencies of people to forgive. We can probably all speak from experience. And forgiveness, it's a topic unto itself. Forgiveness of those who deliberately injured us may be the most difficult of all acts of Christian fidelity to Christ. That is to forgive, ahead of time, before I see them again, give them over into the hands of God, those who have injured us, when in fact what we'd like to do is keep our own hands on them and put our hands around their throat and punish them in the name of justice for the injuries that they've caused in our lives or perhaps in the lives of others that we care about. To let go of that and to forgive them to God, it's not easy. I think we can all attest to that. And so forgiveness is not dispensed lightly. In fact, it's so costly that Joseph doesn't automatically forgive his brothers until he first arranged an experiment to discern whether or not they were genuinely penitent. And indeed, they were at least adequately so in word and in deed. They had changed. And therefore, Joseph was willing to pay the price of forgiveness. And it hurts. That's because sin has to always be paid for by somebody. I've used this analogy before, but when I was a kid, as a young competitive swimmer, right, as like an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old, the first lane lines which ran between each lane in the pool were just nylon pieces of rope against which were stapled these blocks of wood. And the waves would come to those lane lines. They would bounce off the block of wood and go back to where they came from. So each lane was creating its own waves that tended to be contained within the lane itself. The wave would come in, it would bounce off and go back to its source. Then they introduced noodle lane lines made out of plastic strung together, and they were not much better because essentially the wave would come in, and rather than bouncing back to its source, it would just lift up and let the wave go underneath it and pass it along to the next swimmer in the next lane, etc., etc. And finally, when I got into high school, you would see these things called honeycomb lane lines. And that was a higher technology. It was made of these plastic items that were strung together, and they were like giant honeycombs. And the wave would come in, it would check in, but it would not check out. Essentially, the wave would come in, it would hit the honeycomb, which would dissipate it into small sections, and then it would essentially die inside the honeycomb. Again, the wave would check in, it would not check out, it would not bounce back, it would not be passed on. And I thought that's a really good analogy of how to deal with sin, right? The first analogy, like the block lane lines, is somebody sins against me. And I say, oh, no, I'm not going to pay for your sin. I'm not going to take that. You're going to pay for your sin. And I injure them right back, demanding that they pay for their own sin, not me. The block lane line. And then the the noodle lane line, where somebody sins against me. And instead of me saying, oh, no, I'm going to injure you back, I take it, But what do I do with it? When I get home, I make my family pay for it. I take it out on them. I've been injured by Fred, and rather than making Fred pay for that sin, somebody's got to pay for it. I'm going to take it out on my family. They're going to pay for Fred's sin. And that's going to create pain for them. And then there's the honeycomb lane line, where Fred sins against me, and I decide at that point not to take it out on Fred, not to strike back, not to injure him, but to turn the other cheek. And neither will I pass it on to somebody else, maybe another driver on the way home, maybe my own family. No, I'm not going to deflect it to somebody else. I'm going to pay the price. I'm going to absorb the pain of the injury myself, entrusting myself to God, acknowledging before God that it hurts not to strike back and not to pass it along. It hurts to pay for sin when in fact I want other people to pay for it, or I want the person who initiated the sin to pay for it. But I say, no, I'm going to pay for that. In my own quiet willingness to absorb and pay the full price and accept the pain of what somebody else did to me without being retributive. And that's essentially what Joseph has decided to do. He's decided not to strike back and not to take it out on somebody else, an unsuspecting third party. And maybe that's why he cried so much. It hurt. It was very, very difficult to do. So it now comes full circle. Joseph unveils his true identity to his brothers. He has them essentially bring the entire family to Egypt, and he cares for them. It's a very happy ending to an otherwise deeply dysfunctional story. A dysfunctional story through which God was at work in the most amazing, both significant and subtle ways throughout. The thread of grace runs all the way through it. So Joseph completes the circle of forgiveness, and he blesses, not only forgives, but he does forgiveness on steroids. He not only forgives them, he blesses them with a life of, frankly, relative luxury relative to Canaan by bringing them to Egypt. So he even enacts the Abrahamic covenant with the most difficult of constituencies, his betraying brothers, his deceiving family members. And he made it possible because of essentially, I think, what is a spiritual secret that Joseph figured out somewhere along the way, somewhere between Canaan and Egypt. It was the very thing that made it possible for Joseph not to just forgive those who had cursed him, but also to bless those who had persecuted him. I mean, how does that happen? How does Joseph habitually forgive and bless people? Many of them were not friends, but foes. What is his secret? What is his spiritual secret? Well, the final chapter of Genesis, chapter 50, gives us a glimpse of the answer. And the setting is that Jacob dies and Joseph's brothers get worried, as if they stayed in Egypt, were betting their lives on whether or not Joseph's forgiveness was genuine or simply done out of deference to their father, who is now out of the picture. And so now they're suddenly thinking, oh my gosh, did we stay too long? Now that our father is gone, will we see the real Joseph? Was he holding back just to keep our father happy? And let me go ahead and read. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father, Jacob, was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? And so they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, once again, Joseph wept, being the tender-hearted man that he was. And his brothers then came and they threw themselves down before him. This is the third time. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, But Joseph said to them, Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And this is the key. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family, and he lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. And also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knee. That was it. But God. You intended, but God. God always holds the trump card. And so much so, Joseph understood that God would use even malicious intent in the service of a larger redemptive story on behalf of his people. And so Joseph got better, not bitter, because God was bigger. So that even his enemies were under the jurisdiction of a God who was bigger and stronger than any of his enemies. And he trusted that God was even working through them amidst the malice and the deception and the deceit. They never had final say over his life. And that's why Joseph could enact the Abrahamic covenant to everyone he encountered. Well, let me just conclude with these 3 questions for Sunday morning. And thank you for hanging in there over the last 5 weeks. Again, what was most meaningful to you about this section? Secondly, what was most puzzling to you? Maybe it remains puzzling. And finally, what kind of person would most benefit from hearing about Joseph, in particular Joseph in this section? I look forward to seeing you then. And once again, thanks for listening.